The year 1940 marked the zenith of Adolf Hitler's power. German military forces had conquered vast territories across continental Europe with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Poland fell in weeks, Scandinavia collapsed, and France, the mighty, victor of World War I, surrendered in humiliating defeat. The Nazi swastika dominated the European landscape from frozen northern territories to warm Mediterranean shores. Yet within 5 short years, everything reversed. Hitler met his end in a Berlin bunker, his capital reduced to smoking ruins, and his 1,000-year Reich utterly annihilated. This catastrophic collapse wasn't merely bad luck or inevitable historical forces. It resulted from devastating errors, profound miscalculations, and inherent weaknesses that guaranteed Germany's destruction from the very moment of its greatest victories. Germany's early triumphs bred a toxic overconfidence that led to immediate, catastrophic mistakes. The Dunkirk episode stands as one of warfare's most baffling decisions. British forces stood trapped against the French coastline, facing complete annihilation with nowhere to retreat. German panzer divisions were positioned to deliver the final crushing blow. Then, inexplicably, Hitler ordered his advancing armour to halt. This mysterious pause allowed over 300,000 Allied soldiers to escape across the English Channel in what history remembers as a miraculous evacuation. Some scholars suggest Hitler harboured hopes for peace negotiations with Britain. Others point to tactical concerns about tank losses in difficult terrain. Regardless of motivation, sparing Britain's entire army ensured continued resistance and planted seeds for the two-front war that would eventually consume Germany. The rescued soldiers would later return to fight in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France itself during the liberation campaigns. Hitler compounded this error by shifting focus to aerial bombardment of Britain. Convinced by Hermann Göring's extravagant promises, he attempted crushing British morale through air power rather than pursuing more critical strategic objectives. The Luftwaffe deployed approximately 2,500 aircraft, while the RAF maintained only 600 to 800 operational fighters during peak operations. Despite numerical superiority, British radar technology and superior command structures neutralized Germany's advantage. German bombers initially targeted RAF airfields and radar installations with devastating effect, bringing British air defences to the breaking point. Then Hitler made another fatal error. After German bombs accidentally struck London, Churchill ordered retaliatory strikes on Berlin. Hitler, consumed by rage over attacks on the Reich capital, redirected the Luftwaffe from military installations to civilian terror bombing. This targeting change gave the RAF precious recovery time. British fighter production actually surpassed German output during this critical period, operating from undamaged factories. The prolonged bombing campaign wasted irreplaceable German aircraft and veteran pilots while leaving Britain intact as a launching platform for future counteroffensives. These early mistakes pale compared to Hitler's most catastrophic decision, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa represented strategic overreach on an incomprehensible scale, committing Germany to fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, the exact scenario that destroyed Imperial Germany in the previous World War. Driven by ideological obsession with conquering Eastern territories and destroying what he considered racially inferior communism, Hitler launched a war of extermination against Earth's largest country. Nearly 4 million German and Axis soldiers crossed Soviet borders along an 1,800-mile front, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. Initial advances proved devastating. Within 3 weeks, German forces penetrated 450 miles into Soviet territory, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and destroying countless aircraft caught on the ground. Hitler confidently predicted Soviet collapse within weeks. Instead, the invasion awakened a nation with virtually unlimited manpower reserves. The Soviet Union fielded over 300 divisions, exceeding the entire German military. The USSR's vast expanse spanning 11 time zones meant even spectacular tactical victories barely dented strategic reserves. As German forces advanced, deeper Their supply lines stretched impossibly thin. While Soviet factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains continued weapons production, Nazi brutality in occupied territories transformed potential liberation from Stalin's oppression into desperate survival struggles. The Wehrmacht's criminal orders directed execution of captured political officers and starvation of millions of Soviet prisoners. Ukrainian and Baltic populations initially welcoming German forces as liberators soon experienced Nazi racial policies' brutal reality: mass executions, deportations for slave labor, systematic starvation. This savagery stiffened resistance and fueled increasingly effective partisan movements that eventually tied down hundreds of thousands of German troops in security operations. The German advance stalled by autumn 1941, bogged down by fierce resistance, extended supply lines, and approaching winter. Hitler catastrophically failed preparing for winter campaigns, providing no winter uniforms, antifreeze, or cold weather equipment because he expected fighting to end before winter arrived. When brutal Russian winter descended with temperatures plunging below -30°C, German forces faced weapons freezing, vehicles refusing to start, and soldiers suffering massive frostbite casualties. Meanwhile, the Red Army, equipped for winter warfare and reinforced by fresh Siberian divisions released from Japanese border duty, launched devastating counteroffensives under General Zhukov. Failure to capture Moscow marked Nazi Germany's first major defeat and ended all hopes for quick Eastern victory. The dream of rapid conquest became an attrition nightmare consuming Wehrmacht strength. Rather than learning from these setbacks, Hitler made even more reckless decisions. In December 1941, days after Japan's Pearl Harbor attack, he declared war on the United States, despite having no treaty obligation and gaining no Japanese military assistance in return. This massive miscalculation virtually guaranteed German defeat by pitting the Reich against the world's largest industrial power. American factories protected by two oceans would soon produce weapons on scales dwarfing German capabilities. The United States eventually fielded 16 million troops, while manufacturing enough equipment to supply not only American forces, but also Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease programs. Declaring war on America also brought the US Navy into the Atlantic battle, where German U-boats had been Germany's most effective weapon against British supply lines. American naval escorts, radar-equipped aircraft, and mass-produced destroyer escorts soon turned the tide decisively against German submarines. On the Eastern Front in 1942, Hitler's obsession with symbolic victories led to the Stalingrad disaster. Rather than concentrating forces for decisive strikes against either Moscow or Caucasus oil fields, Hitler characteristically pursued multiple objectives simultaneously, dividing forces to capture both Stalingrad and oil resources. The decision to fight for Stalingrad itself, rather than simply cutting river traffic, transformed a strategic objective into a prestige battle consuming irreplaceable German resources. The siege devolved into urban warfare nightmare, where German advantages in mobility and combined arms were neutralized. Soviet defenders fighting from their own city's rubble proved impossible to dislodge despite months of bloody combat. When Soviet forces launched encirclement operations in November 1942, trapping the German Sixth Army, Hitler faced crucial decisions. His generals pleaded for permission to break out and retreat to defensible positions. Instead, Hitler ordered doomed forces to stand fast, promising aerial supply that never materialized. For 3 months, the Sixth Army slowly starved and froze, while Hitler refused evacuation attempts. In February 1943, over 90,000 German soldiers surrendered in catastrophe, marking the beginning of Germany's end. Destroying an entire army at Stalingrad eliminated elite German forces and shattered Wehrmacht invincibility myths. From that point, German forces remained permanently defensive across all fronts. These strategic blunders weren't simply military miscalculations. They flowed directly from Hitler's toxic ideology and increasing megalomania. Hitler viewed the war not as conventional conflict, but as ideological crusade, a racial war against Jews and Slavs and fight to the death with communism. This worldview systematically poisoned German strategic thinking at every level. Traditional military objectives like securing territory, controlling resources, or neutralizing enemy forces were consistently subordinated to ideological goals, making no military sense. The result was a war machine working against its own interests at every turn. In occupied Eastern Europe, Nazi racial policies transformed what could have been Germany's greatest strategic asset into devastating liability. When German forces first crossed into Soviet territory, many local populations, particularly in Ukraine, the Baltics, and Belarus, initially welcomed them as liberators from Stalin's brutal regime. The Soviet system had terrorized these regions through forced collectivization, mass deportations, and systematic purges. Millions had suffered under communist rule and genuinely hoped German occupation might bring relief. Some Ukrainian and Baltic units even volunteered fighting alongside German forces against the Red Army. Instead of exploiting this incredible strategic opportunity, Nazi racial ideology demanded Slavic populations be treated as subhuman. Himmler's plans called for systematic extermination or enslavement of tens of millions of Slavs to make room for German settlers. Local populations soon discovered Nazi occupation was far worse than Soviet oppression. Mass executions, arbitrary deportations for slave labor, and deliberate starvation policies turned potential allies into implacable enemies. Villages that might have provided intelligence, supplies, and recruits became partisan resistance centers. The Wehrmacht found itself fighting not only the Red Army, but also increasingly sophisticated guerrilla warfare, tying down hundreds of thousands of troops in security operations. By 1944, hundreds of thousands of German troops were tied down in anti-partisan operations across occupied Europe, forces desperately needed on front lines. These security divisions, composed largely of older reservists and foreign volunteers, proved increasingly ineffective against partisan units enjoying local support and terrain knowledge. Similarly, Hitler's obsession with exterminating Jews and other groups diverted massive resources from war efforts. The Holocaust wasn't just morally catastrophic, it was strategically insane. Train lines desperately needed for military supplies instead carried deportation trains. Industrial facilities that could have produced weapons instead processed murder on industrial scales. The SS diverted enormous manpower and resources to genocide that could have been used militarily. Skilled Jewish workers, engineers, and scientists who might have contributed to German war production were systematically murdered. Meanwhile, the administrative machinery of the final solution consumed bureaucratic capacity and logistics the Wehrmacht desperately needed. This ideological fanaticism also shaped German occupation policies throughout Europe. Rather than creating a European confederation united against Soviet communism, a potentially winning strategy, Nazi racial theories demanded brutal subjugation of supposedly inferior peoples. France, despite military defeat, retained enough autonomy to eventually contribute to Allied victory through resistance movements. Norway, Denmark, and other occupied countries became sources of intelligence and sabotage rather than willing collaborators. The war progressed. Hitler's early diplomatic successes in the late 1930s had fed dangerous overconfidence, convincing him of his own military genius. These victories, achieved through bluff and intimidation rather than military prowess, created fatal delusion that Hitler's intuition surpassed professional military expertise. Hitler increasingly dismissed his generals' expertise, famously declaring, "His generals knew nothing," and systematically marginalizing the very professionals who created Wehrmacht's early tactical successes. The German officer corps, products of the world's most sophisticated military education system, found their expertise increasingly dismissed in favor of Hitler's ideological certainties and intuitive hunches. By late 1941, frustrated with military setbacks and convinced his commanders lacked sufficient National Socialist fervor, Hitler literally took direct command of the Wehrmacht. After dismissing General von Brauchitsch, he assumed the role of commander-in-chief of the army, making himself directly responsible for tactical decisions on multiple fronts simultaneously. The consequences proved catastrophic for German military effectiveness. Hitler began micromanaging battlefield decisions from headquarters, often hundreds of miles from front lines, with little understanding of local tactical realities. His infamous no-retreat orders transformed rational tactical withdrawals into needless disasters, destroying entire German formations. This pattern repeated across multiple theaters, with devastating consistency. At Stalingrad, experienced commanders pleaded for permission, conducting fighting withdrawals to defensible positions. Instead, Hitler's rigid insistence on holding every inch of ground led to encirclement and destruction of the entire Sixth Army. Over 200,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in battle, serving no strategic purpose, beyond Hitler's prestige. In North Africa, similar inflexibility prevented Rommel from conducting mobile defense that might have preserved the Afrika Korps. When the British Eighth Army launched its offensive at El Alamein, German forces were forced fighting from fixed positions, negating their maneuver warfare advantages. The result was another devastating defeat that could have been avoided through tactical flexibility. The Normandy campaign provided perhaps the most glaring example of Hitler's tactical incompetence. When Allied forces landed on D-Day, German commanders on scene immediately recognized the landing's significance and requested permission deploying panzer reserves. Hitler, sleeping late and refusing to be awakened, delayed crucial decisions for hours. Even worse, his preconceptions about Allied strategy, reinforced by successful deception operations, led him believing Normandy landings were merely diversions. For weeks after D-Day, he insisted on holding back strongest German divisions, convinced the real invasion would still come at Pas-de-Calais. By the time he acknowledged his error, Allied forces had established unshakable footholds in France. This micromanagement extended beyond tactical decisions to strategic planning. Hitler's interference in research and development led to numerous technological disasters. His insistence that the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter be configured as a bomber rather than interceptor delayed its deployment in air defense until Allied bombing had already crippled German industry. Over time, Hitler eventually fell out, with most of his high command. All 4 of his army chiefs of staff were dismissed and roughly 2/3 of his field marshals and many senior generals were removed. This purge eliminated much of the Wehrmacht's institutional knowledge and battlefield expertise. Veterans of the Eastern Front who understood modern warfare realities were replaced by Nazi Party loyalists who prioritized ideological purity over military competence. The result was increasingly dysfunctional command structure that couldn't adapt to changing battlefield conditions. Perhaps most destructively, Hitler's ideological fanaticism bred fatal miscalculations about Germany's strategic situation. So committed to the idea of Nazi supremacy, he consistently downplayed material realities that any rational assessment would have recognized as insurmountable. When confronted with evidence of Allied industrial superiority, Hitler dismissed concerns, with rhetoric about German willpower overcoming material disadvantages. He genuinely believed National Socialist ideology provided spiritual strength that could compensate for numerical and industrial inferiority, a delusion proving tragically false when tested against Allied firepower. Beyond strategy and ideology lay an even more fundamental problem. World War II was ultimately a contest of industrial might, and here Germany faced insurmountable disadvantages from the very beginning. Despite impressive initial victories, the Nazi economy was structurally unprepared for prolonged total war that Hitler's limitless ambitions had unleashed. Germany's economic vulnerabilities were evident even before war began. The Reich lacked access to critical raw materials that modern warfare demanded in enormous quantities. Oil, the lifeblood of mechanized armies, had to be imported or produced through expensive synthetic processes. Rubber for vehicle tires came from distant colonies now controlled by enemies. High-grade iron ore for quality steel was largely imported from Sweden, a supply line vulnerable to Allied naval power. Meanwhile, increasingly effective Allied blockade strangled German imports. British naval supremacy, reinforced by American vessels after December 1941, created an economic noose around the Reich. Once Hitler expanded the conflict to multiple fronts, through his declaration of war on the United States, the resource imbalance became absolutely overwhelming. By late 1941, Germany confronted not only British and Soviet production, but also the industrial arsenal of the United States, whose gross domestic product exceeded all Axis powers combined by nearly 2-to-1. The numbers tell stories of inevitable defeat. American factories, protected by two oceans and supercharged by mass production techniques pioneered in Detroit automobile plants, began generating weapons and equipment on scales defying imagination. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 114,000 new aircraft compared to Germany's 40,000, nearly a 3-to-1 advantage in a single year. Even more dramatically, American shipyards launched over 2,700 Liberty ships during the war, replacing merchant vessel losses faster than German U-boats could sink them. Revolutionary shipbuilding techniques reduced construction time from months to weeks, with some Liberty ships completed in just 4 days. This industrial miracle ensured Allied supply lines remained open despite massive German submarine campaigns. Tank production revealed similar disparities. By 1943, the Soviet Union alone was producing over 24,000 tanks annually, while the United States added another 29,000. German tank production peaked at just 19,000 vehicles in 1944, impressive by historical standards, but hopelessly inadequate against combined Allied output exceeding 50,000 tanks per year. Even with Albert Speer's impressive late-war industrial reforms that temporarily boosted German output through rationalization and slave labor, it was never enough. By 1943, the Allies were manufacturing 5 to 6 times more airplanes annually than Germany, with similarly dominant advantages in virtually every category of military equipment. The Allies also enjoyed vast manpower superiority that Germany's aging population couldn't match. At war's height, 26 million Allied soldiers were in uniform versus 17 million Axis troops, a gap widening steadily as conflict progressed. Oil became the Reich's Achilles heel. The country's mechanized military consumed petroleum at rates domestic production and synthetic fuel plants couldn't sustain. Before war, Germany imported 85% of its oil, primarily from the Soviet Union and Romania. Operation Barbarossa eliminated Soviet supplies overnight, while Romania's oil fields, though vital to German operations, produced only fractions of Wehrmacht requirements. By war's final year, German panzer divisions were reduced to tactical immobility due to fuel shortages. The once feared Wehrmacht, built around rapid mechanized advances, found itself increasingly dependent on horse-drawn transport belonging to an earlier warfare era. Meanwhile, the Allies leveraged their economic superiority through devastating strategic bombing campaigns that systematically dismantled German war production. From 1943 onward, massive Allied bomber fleets hammered German industrial cities around the clock in unprecedented economic warfare campaigns. If you found this analysis revealing, there's much more to explore about how authoritarian regimes inevitably contain seeds of their own destruction. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's most significant turning points and the lessons they hold for our world today.